Final Fantasy IX returns to the medieval fantasy setting of the older titles, foregoing the overt sci-fi settings of the previous two games. But perhaps even more striking is its decision to also ditch the art style those two games had gradually evolved to have. When Final Fantasy was being released on sprite-based consoles, characters were depicted in a cute, exaggerated way, though with the implication on the box art and promotional material that these were perhaps abstract stand-ins for more realistically proportioned people. As early as Final Fantasy II, the series would sometimes show those more realistic character interpretations in the menu screens, and by Final Fantasy VII they'd even made it into the battle sequences, if not when navigating around the game world. FF8 finally bridged the gap entirely, with realistically proportioned characters throughout the entire game. And right as this was achieved, FF9 returns to that more abstract style, with realistic proportioned versions of the characters relegated to just the discs, and not even that if you're playing with a North American copy of the game. While throwing us back to the medieval setting of Final Fantasy with FF9, there's no reason the game couldn't have also kept the same realistic characters of FF8, and yet we also revert to the abstraction of old here too. The realistic depictions on the discs don't even make an appearance in the menu screen. The game doesn't just want to wax nostalgic with the settings of older Final Fantasy, but the aesthetics of it too, with a more abstract world that invites your brain to regard the game's events as somewhat less literal, somewhat less serious, much more deliberately than the older games themselves, which had to work around more restrictive hardware when picking a direction. In a way, it frames the older games and their setting as something more childish and simplistic than the newer, more modern settings of FF7 and 8. The newer games with their sci-fi are presented as starkly clear and objective, partially in 7 and completely in 8, while the medieval setting is draped in the cloudy, abstract fog of a more playful, childish look. That could be interpreted as a slight against the old, but considering how much the game muses on what it's like to be an inferior model, made to be replaced, perhaps there's something appropriate in the game draping itself in an older aesthetic that skews towards the simple and the disposable, in a story that doesn't view those as inherently negative traits. The Black Mage sprite is viewed as just as valid in the 3D era by FF9. Rather than altering the design so the look matches the original framing, a mere costume covering a human's face, they let the design filter over to FF9's 3D world largely unaltered. In doing it that way, bestowing upon the Black Mage a new context, that of a sad kind of creature. Vivi's Black Mage design, the past, still has something to say perhaps, now out of its time, maybe even more than before. Of course, there's also practical reasons for picking the overall art style they did. Simple designs allow for some extra expressive poses on the still primitive, and by 2000, aging PS1 hardware. Characters can also get away with being a little less rational in a more cartoony world, which is perhaps more of a crutch than a practical tool, but still, I'm willing to give the average brain-dead NPC a little more benefit of the doubt when their hands are the size of Kabuki fans. But only just a little more. A childlike view of the world isn't such a bad frame of mind to be in either when starting the game, playing as the young Vivi entering the town of Alexandria in hopes of seeing a play. The city feels big and sprawling at this point from such a small creature's perspective. There's something warm about the twilight-drenched Alexandria, but also an indifference to little things passing through, to the city's own detriment, as weapons of destruction like Vivi, and even little princes like Puck pass by unnoticed. The initial team here is a perfect mix to get the adventure going with energy. A cheeky thief looking to kidnap a princess, the princess that wants to be kidnapped, her noble no-nonsense knight bodyguard who wants her to go home, and a good-natured wayward soul caught up in it all. There's plenty of room for fun banter as the group's goals overlap just enough for them to stay together. These early hours are some of my favorites in the game. Zidorn, Garnet, Steiner, and Vivi crash out of Alexandria into the surrounding country, and are met with barren fields, hostile caves, and locked-off border checkpoints. If the game begins on the stage, then these early levels feel like you've been knocked backstage. The glamorous bustle of Alexandria at the start is the production, behind which lies a world of discarded ropes and pulleys, nervous stagehands who brush you away so they can get back to crouching behind the set. You get to suss out the world naturally by nibbling at the edges until you finally reach a small population where the vibe is certainly off, as it's revealed to be a secret factory for the Black Mages, a series of attack dogs for the recently warmongering Alexandria, of which Vivi is one. What's nice is that his companions, almost straight after this revelation, are quick to say it shouldn't matter what his origin is. Of course, his good-natured companions don't care from moment one of the reveal, because they're solid people and like Vivi. It's gonna be Vivi himself who will have to mull it over throughout the game and come to terms with things. It's realistic and true to life. Receiving positive reassurance from friends isn't the end goal of wrestling within a conflict. Usually it's just the first step in a process that has to come from within. Self-development comes in all flavors in an RPG, of course. Here you tease out each party member's moves by putting on equipment that unlocks said move, though only permanently if you grind out enough enemies while wearing it. This offers you a kind of playstyle gradient to put yourself on as you progress through the game, that on one end could have you stopping to grind out a move the second you get new equipment, or on the other have you simply equipping whatever equipment has the highest stats and letting the move chips fall where they may. Somewhere in the middle of this gradient you might prioritize stats but hold off replacing a helmet for a slightly better one if you stand the chance of keeping a particularly good move for the long run. It's a gradient of choice, but at the end of the day it's all going in the same direction, which is getting every character their moves sooner or later. There's definitely a large "can I be asked" component to the system that asks you if you can be bothered to grind out fights in service of maximizing a character's breadth of ability early. A trickier choice is perhaps which of your unlocked passive abilities to actually equip, since turning on these carries a point cost that can take substantial time to get more of. These aren't a huge concern outside of major fights, but when a boss is on the horizon, it can be important to have a play around with these. But the largest element of choice doesn't actually come until about 25 to 30 hours into the game, when you finally get the option of creating your own party out of the 8 available teammates. Until then, the game largely makes the party for you, as characters come and go from the story, or the game shifts between characters in different parts of the world. This of course comes with benefits. At some point you're forced to use every playable character, so everyone gets some use and feels like they were a presence in the adventure, even if you dump them in a bin in Disc 3. It also allows the story to cover more ground in the midsection as we cross-cut between events across the world. The downside is that without any way to shift a character's role in combat, the broad strategies end up making themselves for much of the first 2/3 of the game. You'll likely heal or dole out support moves and items with Garnet or your weakest available party member, while trying to deal damage with the other 3. Let me underline again that the problem isn't so much you can't change characters for so long in the game, but that the roles of the characters you get can't be changed. Usually either letting the player switch characters or letting the player edit roles can help mix things up. You maybe don't have to let both happen, but neither is pretty restrictive. It's hard to say if the return to 4 party members in battle makes the game easier than 7 and 8. Giving Garnet the healing spells and defensive buffs, forcing you to pick one or the other each turn, certainly helps mitigate a sharp drop in difficulty. It also feels like the enemies are balanced in such a way to accommodate all 3 other characters attacking each turn, since when the game forces you to have both Garnet and Eiko in the team, having only 2 consistent attackers makes the game feel like it's going much slower. That all said though, it seems like all the larger team size offers is the chance for enemies to have larger health pools when you're locked into fewer strategies in the first 2 discs. And once those strategies become available, with party creation, there's not much game left to give enemies complex movesets. Even the mission Kuja forces you into in Disc 3, that splits the party up, has you selecting your team at the outset without much info on what will be to come. So even this section has to be fairly easy to accommodate any formation chosen. Even if you don't take heed of the clue that magic might be disabled at some point on the mission, the game can't really risk getting you stuck by making that trap too hard to overcome. So only a small handful of major levels are really left for getting the most out of using the party switch to make informed choices, and on a casual playthrough nothing really sticks out as that strategically taxing, outside of maybe the final boss. It's worth noting too that by the later hours, you'll probably have figured out the always satisfying yet game-ending late-game ability combos that do silly damage, and make strategizing for specific scenarios less important. Of course, earlier, when the game is forcing its team formations down your throat, it still constitutes variety. Having to work for a bit without a dedicated white mage will force you to find other healing avenues. Kina's unique skill learning mechanic will have you approaching fights differently, whittling down enemy health as much as possible without delivering the killing blow. In that sense, FF9 is well designed as a more casual RPG, where the game deciding the makeup of your team for you introduces you naturally to different ways to play. The game doesn't get monotonous, but it won't leave you puzzled for long either. While you could argue a lot of these design decisions represent trade-offs, one thing for another, the outright flaws of FF9's gameplay don't need much analysis to spot. Battle intro animations take way too long and break the game's pace. Triggering trance strategically is almost impossible, and the card game explaining itself so poorly creates a needless barrier between you and the side quest. Though once you figure it out, the random dice rolls involved might just turn you off anyway and have you grateful there's no major rewards involved for doing it. One thing that's almost flawless is the game world presentation. The stylized look of the characters blend well with the fuzzy pre-renders behind them, a soft pastel color palette, blending everything together into a kind of hazy dream world. The shot composition of these pre-rendered levels has come a long way already since FF7, with dynamic angles keeping things interesting. This is without mentioning the detail of the backgrounds themselves, which is exquisite. Something in the background is always twisting or turning, managing to give the sense that an ancient world with considerable history is still growing around you, or with just what are essentially still images that can occasionally twitch here and there. The environments look so good that frankly never has the transition to the battle screens felt like more of a downgrade. These 3D rendered environments can't help but be mostly devoid of the intricate splendor of the world outside them. Of course, without pre-renders, the battle screens can have a camera that floats around to get different perspectives on things. But I can't help but wonder if we could have gotten more striking battle environments with a pre-rendered approach, even if it meant foregoing these different angles. The soundtrack can be incredibly atmospheric, often clouding the world in a dreamlike fog all its own. But I'd be lying if I said any of it was terribly memorable to me outside of a couple of key tracks. Tracks like Kuja's villain monologue theme managed to evoke a lot less than Sephiroth's, while seemingly doing a lot more. And the battle theme is one place where the old school FF callbacks undermine the game, since every time I try to recall the track, the opening recreating that of the older themes just causes my mind to think of those older battle themes instead. I couldn't even hum it to you right now, and I've heard it play for many hours. See, that's not the right one. That's not the right one. Maybe the battle theme itself is just a bit generic, and as the track you'll be hearing half the time you play, that's a big hit against the title's OST for me. Again though, presentation certainly isn't this game's low point. Once the characters escape the lower world to the city of Lindblum, it's a stark contrast from what you've seen up to this point, as if the round, comfy hobbit huts of the game so far have amalgamated into this giant metropolis. Big cogs and gears selling the idea of a metropolis of sci-fi scale within a medieval fantasy world. Here the team splits, with Zidane wanting to help an old friend and Gane wanting to return home to address what her kingdom has been doing. I think this is a good idea, to show these two operate without each other and not have their characters be defined just by their dynamic when together, which is a good one. They have a fun chemistry right off the bat, and the game does a good job at finding realistic reasons to prolong the tension and not have them get together straight away. Thankfully, not by having them anime stutter at each other for half the game like some other titles might. Gane has a lot of big, distracting responsibilities to deal with throughout the story, but maybe more importantly, Zidane has a tendency to keep his options open by hitting on other girls, which gets in the way a little. The game's story can at times be deceptively simplistic, only to then reveal an added layer of depth. Steiner's willful ignorance to Alexandria's warmongering starts to get repetitive after a while, but they end up dragging it out so much, and he is so bitterly devoted despite all evidence around him, that it ends up going from played-out comic relief all the way to something rather tragic and contemplative as his self-worth erodes. Then seeing him find a way to channel his loyalty to Alexandria positively into protecting its people is satisfying. His love of queen and country even serving as a common interest to get a girlfriend. Nicely done. Similarly, Amarant gets the mother of all lessons for babies from Zidane when he's told that having friends to back you up is a good thing if you trip and fall alone. But the fragility of his own CBeebies level advice becomes evident later when Zidane struggles to place full stock in it himself. There's a good diversity of environment here. Bolmisia complements its cold and calculated denizens well, not just with the permanent rain, but with its jagged, indifferent architecture. Another great detail is making the save points Moogles. It's a simple touch that helps create the sense that you're not the only one traveling the world, that word of events throughout the land is spreading and having an effect. The villains are seeking Gane as a means to extract the summoning power she was born with. I like how this dormant power is made evident early on through the game's mechanical language. Abilities displayed in her menu, she just lacks a big enough magic meter to deploy. Innate powers, she doesn't have the field experience to use yet. Having an enigmatic catwalk schemer working behind the scenes be the real villain isn't all that novel, but what is the discovery that Kuja's cool, superior aloofness still hasn't been entirely earned, and he's still only dressing, albeit scantily, for the job he wants. Garland comes crackling down and reveals that we haven't joined the story at a point where the main villain, the immediate threat to the world, has it all figured out. He's trying to outflank some greater force with advanced technology. It makes for a deliciously tantalizing third act, where it becomes more unclear how things are going to play out. The third disc, as discussed, is where the game opens up mechanically, letting you pick a team you want. It's a shame the game doesn't let you switch out members whenever you like, asking you to return to your ship for a switch. It discourages some of the experimentation now available to you. This might be in order to not let you switch out members on the fly when others are low on health, but what are we really trying to prevent here? A player being offered an extra life when navigating the few remaining linear dungeons? Honestly, if a party member is low on health or magic in dangerous territory, asking the player to pick between restorative resources or mixing up their strategy with a character change sounds like an interesting choice to propose, and would probably help the player organically have a more even-leveled cast by the game's end. While the outer continents are pretty barren in terms of towns and populations, I actually quite like the mood this brings to these later hours. You're out in dangerous unexplored lands, so it makes sense the comfy little pockets of civilized life out there would be small, made up by explorers, scholars, and pilgrims. It's not a bad time to pull back a bit on all the chat to let the player experiment with their newfound mechanical freedom too. In terms of cast, characters like Zidane, Vivi, Steiner, Gane, and Eiko get offered a fair amount of material and development. The other half of the team end up a little undercooked. Eiko's storyline about a 6-year-old who sets out on a journey from her broken hometown to find new parents doesn't exactly do much for me as an adult player, but out of some of these guys it ends up being one of the juicier arcs. Freya's storyline feels unfinished, and Amarant serves his purpose as the friendship plot device without it going much deeper. I wouldn't say it's a huge black mark or anything against the game, that we don't get some kind of deep exploration of a comedy relief character like Kina, even if Steiner did get one, but it is worth noting that prior FF games have done a better job at evening out the drama across the whole main party. Now we're going to have to talk about late game specifics, because that's when the real meat of the material kicks in. After some detective work, the cast take a trip to Terra, an alternate world Kuja and Garland come from, as well as it turns out, Zidane. Terra is populated by genomes, humanoid creatures deliberately made by Garland with a little will or personality to serve as vessels for a long-gone civilization seeking eternal life. Kuja and Zidane are also genomes, except they were sent to the regular world of Gaia, by Garland, to thin out the population there, making way for Terra to take over. At some point, Kuja got off the leash and started scheming to accrue power for himself. He was also responsible for Zidane getting dropped off in Gaia without any knowledge of his purpose. It's all a little more complicated than that, though. Terra has already fused with Gaia in a kind of weird superimposed way, and there's a plan that involves preventing Gaia souls reaching a crystal that keeps Gaia alive to weaken the planet and let the world of Terra overtake Gaia. This is part of the issue, of course. All of this kind of clunks into the station, interrupting the emotional weight of the revelation, by having the player try to decipher what disrupting the flow of souls means. Just a fancy way of saying killing people? Or something they're not getting? The sudden twist that the light-hearted loverboy scamp Zidane is secretly a genetically engineered weapon of destruction has an amateurish, tropey energy to it, like something an 11-year-old might come up with to spice up the stakes in the fantasy adventure he's scribbling in the back of his maths book. That's not because the twist doesn't serve the themes of the game well or have a purpose. As we get closer to the end, Zidane's origin becomes very poignant, but when the blunt yet very pliable foreshadowing the game offers for this is just that Zidane has amnesia about his childhood and doesn't remember his past, it gives the overall execution a kind of lazy energy. Compare it to FF7, where each revelation in Cloud's backstory snaps into place like snug puzzle pieces, each one making sense of decisions made and odd quirks the character exhibited throughout the game. More importantly, there's plenty to re-examine about Cloud when replaying with the revelations in mind, while Zidane's twist doesn't give you much to think about when re-examining. That said, I like how Vivi's origin as a weapon is made clear pretty early on, as it's a smart way to put the player at ease and assume this role in the story has already been filled. But as it turns out, being a tool for others, born expected to carry out some designated role before planned obsolescence, isn't just a burden for the little sad creature of the team, but as the game reveals, a much more universal issue that affects the main hero and even the game's main villain. At first, when Kuja finds out his lifespan was artificially limited, his insane final gambit to end all life may seem simplistic and unmotivated, but it is founded in some kind of rationale. To him, it equalizes the playing field and resolves in a blunt, frustrated way the issues others in the game have wrestled with. No more being of lesser or more importance, somebody's master or somebody's tool, having a longer or shorter lifespan, all are made equal through death. He's a dark inversion of Vivi, built as a weapon and whose lifespan is relatively limited, but who reflected on this same dilemma in a more healthy way. While Zidane's origins are a clunky twist and all of Garland's nattering can be obtuse, there are of course aspects of this revelation's execution that are handled very well. How well designed the interior of his lair is elevates the moment considerably. Harsh and metallic and synthetic, it has nothing in common with the lovingly made towns or villages before it. The metal platforms that look like spiral shells bring to mind mollusks, of which some can reproduce asexually, fitting for the world of genomes, synthetically created by one entity. There's these slits in the walls that look like giant eyes, also fitting for a sinister world keeping watch over another. At least I thought that was a good observation until they just did actual eyes on the walls right after. It can certainly be argued that finding a way to devise a malleable set piece within the confines of a strict gameplay language is only commendable to a certain extent, giving yourself a limited canvas, then wanting a reward for working around it. Yet initial expectations of what's possible within the game's framework can't help but result in an effective set piece. When against those self-imposed odds, it finds a way to integrate all 8 party members into a single prolonged sequence that weaves in gameplay for a simple yet impactful character moment. An overwhelmed, guilty Zidane, feeling disconnected from the world after the revelations of his origin and what it implies, wants to go it alone, but his friends won't let him. It's not the game's deepest moment, but it's satisfying to see the help Zidane has offered others be rewarded by support in this series of battles. The music here is great too. It starts simple with a strained energy, like the other characters coming to join Zidane on his lone, staggering march, successive instruments come in one by one to strengthen that weak underlying sound. Transforming it into something much stronger and bolder. It's heartwarming to see any of these characters stick up for Zidane this way, but the highlight for me was definitely seeing Steiner pledge his sword to Zidane. Despite their initial antagonism and clash of personality, they may be a little more like each other than they first assumed. The final fight has you take on a tranced Kuja. Mechanically, trance feels like an afterthought, and while it's cool, it's more than just a mechanic, playing into the narrative as well. Its inclusion there comes off just as half-baked, which I can't imagine Kina specifically would be happy about. At an earlier point in the game, Kuja dropped all his prior plans, searching the world for summons, to instead try and replicate the protagonist's superpowered up move. And his explanation for how he did this is so quick and abrupt, following the thread of it all is a bit too hard. As much leeway as I like giving fantasy plots for vague logic, in service of making the player ponder the possibilities, or to get them caught up in a moment of wonder, FF9 does have a few jotting nails in its plot I've struggled to hammer in. The one that vexes me the most is if Garland needs Kuja and Zidane to thin out Gaia, why doesn't he just fly around on his big laser ship that can blast everything to smithereens, instead of percolating invasions over thousands of years? Does he just want as much real estate as possible intact for the Terran occupation? I don't think wars between nations instigated by Kuja are going to be much of an improvement. The ship has a laser beam that can take out the summon Alexander, which Kuja and the gang spent the first half of the game trying to find for its supposed power and importance. Reasons why the big laser can't be used over and over is a thing that to me should have been highlighted. I don't necessarily need a great reason why Kuja's final gambit to destroy all life manifested a god of death called a Necron, but making it the final boss feels misguided. Instead of one of the villains we have some kind of relationship with. Though I do get thematically the idea of a representation of death being the final boss in this game. A lot of our characters do kind of have a relationship with death. And I quite like where the game lands after all is said and done. Necron's not a super hard final boss, but I'd say the challenge is high enough for one. What with him having one of those mess up the whole team attacks that makes things a bit of a struggle even if you have your cheekiest moves at the ready. After Necron is beaten, surprisingly Kuja has a change of heart, and Zidane leaves the team to go rescue him after Kuja helps them escape the final level's destruction. Kuja's change of heart feels sudden, and Zidane's decision to abandon the team and save him in turn feels uncalculated, despite the debt he's repaying. It feels more driven by a sense of instinct, like when he went back to help Amarant. These two at the last minute suddenly deciding to save each other and then sit around hand in hand, no big dealing it, comes off as kind of like a convenient mushy note to end off on. Yet while thinking that, I cast my mind back to an older scene, one in which Zidane questions what the point is in trying to interpret a character's intentions in a story. I don't think a game as thoughtful as this is anti-analysis or intellectualizing a story. I don't even think the game thinks Zidane is entirely in the right here, but his outlook is often validated by the game. Zidane, running on his carefree instincts and heart, is often portrayed as him being at his strongest, and we see that when he veers away from that carefree attitude into overthinking, that's when he's at his weakest. And so with Kuja and Zidane making up, maybe all that matters is that things work out in the end, and less the mechanics of how we got there. The cynical way to look at this would be to say the game just asks of you to not think and do what you want. But I'd say it's more about figuring out what you need to figure out, but not letting it define you. That's of course reflected in Vivi's story. The character that goes through so much inner turmoil throughout the game over his origin, his reduced lifespan, and he's the one when all is said and done that basically goes, it wasn't a big deal. I think the game is telling us to live a little more and overthink a little less. That's why Necron makes sense as the final boss. All this thinking about life and death is getting in the way of living. While playing, I pictured Vivi's arc culminating in some sort of sacrifice, him trading his shorter life for the lives of his friends. But instead he dies off screen, and I think there's something important about the game not dramatizing Vivi's death. Instead the point is, he made the most of his short life rather than wallowing in self-pity and martyrdom. He had a family. Kuja and Necron owned. Damn. I think if FF9 fails at one thing, it's unifying these themes across the whole game. A lot of it winds around into cul-de-sacs, and only 3 or 4 characters really feel essential to what's trying to be said by the end, as much as the title screen cards might try to imply otherwise. That aside though, my outlook on the game is a positive one. After a game like FF7 about reserved characters plagued with self-doubt, it makes sense to mix things up by underlining what that game maybe didn't have enough time to highlight amongst the sound of screamed self-actualization, the melody of life. Maybe the sweetest sound of all. It's ultimately a more simple message. This game isn't as intricately constructed or as thought-provoking as 7 to me, but the art style, the childlike throwback in its aesthetic, it's setting you up for that, to deliver its own well-balanced cocktail of complementing flavors. Well, actually, if FF7 is a cocktail, 9 is more of a mocktail. It tastes how you might expect with its classic combat, but lacks some of the freedoms you'd get with a more adult drink. Zesty yet less aggressive, cheeky but in bed by 10, to rise early the next morning enthusiastically. The final celebration scene I do think is fumbled by the color scheme. The twilight atmosphere fits something more melancholic, rather than the affirmation of life the game is going for. Didn't leave me with the right taste in my mouth, but we won't return to that cocktail metaphor again. Or maybe you might see it as the perfect mood for the final scene. The sun is setting on us, but we're going to enjoy our time anyway. Interpretive moments like that can be good. Interpretive moments like what the hell is Garland on about, not so good. I always wonder in these older foreign games if localization has me missing something, but either way the overall spirit of the game is undeniable, inviting you in with cheeky, colourful, doll-like characters, revealing a dark underside to it all, but ending with the bright-eyed enthusiasm it hooks you in with, not letting itself be defeated. Appropriate for a game trying to return to the style of its earliest entries, to prove that spirit still has a place after everything we've been through.